You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Tonight's episode will be focusing on May Day, also known as International Workers' Day. May Day is celebrated across the world every year on May 1st. As Peter Linebaugh writes in his book, The Incomplete, True, Authentic, and Wonderful History of May Day, this annual ritual has both green and red roots for anarchists. The green reaching back to the various pagan festivals of spring and honoring of the forest, and the red tradition of May Day, which emerges in the bloody worker struggle of the late 19th century and the infamous Haymarket Affair in Chicago in 1886. Both the red and the green currents are rich sources of inspiration for anti-capitalists today. In 2006, May Day made a big comeback on this continent with a general strike called for by undocumented migrants across the United States in response to draconian reforms to immigration law. Millions hit the streets on May 1st, which was declared a day without an immigrant. In 2012, on the tail end of the Occupy movement, and amidst a major student strike happening across Quebec, anarchists across the continent called for strikes, socials, blockades, and combative street protest as part of a wave of anti-capitalist resistance, and May Day burst back into the public consciousness. Since 2012, May Day has been marked in cities and towns across so-called Canada, mostly organized by some combination of anarchists, communists, immigrant rights groups, and/or labor unions. Tonight, we bring you reports from across the country and short interviews with organizers in Halifax, Montreal, and Kitchener. In making this episode, we were struck by how tactically different May Day events looked in different places, but yet how similar they were in their messages and themes this year. We begin here in Kingston, where about 200 people attended a free barbecue in Skeleton Park. Speakers presented on a range of struggles taking place in the community, including gentrification in the Skeleton Park neighborhood, anti-colonial pipeline resistance, the rise of the far right and the targeting of immigrants, the closing of homeless shelters across the city, and solidarity with anarchists facing repression in Hamilton. This is Bailey speaking on behalf of Solidarity Kingston.
Solidarity Kingston is a local group that believes everyone should be able to meet their basic needs with dignity and on their own terms, and in particular our group focuses on migrant justice. Our current work includes both local advocacy and outreach, as well as supporting wider migrant justice movements, including the fight for status for all in so-called Canada. There's a few reasons we wanted to speak at May Day today. The first relates to clear ties between May Day as a day to celebrate and fight for workers' struggles and the specific context of migrant workers in Canada. Of the hundreds of thousands of people working in Canada through temporary foreign worker programs, many are not afforded the same rights and protections granted to many Canadian workers. In fields like agriculture and childcare, worker status is tied to their contract with one employer, putting a huge amount of power in the employer's hands. Workers face unsafe or even sexually violent workplaces often, and if workers are injured or if they complain about workplace conditions, they can be fired and sent back to their home country with no recourse. They pay taxes and pay into unemployment insurance without being able to access EI or healthcare services. And despite working for years in Canada at low wage, difficult, and sometimes unsafe work, many are never eligible for permanent residency. So as a start, it's really important to highlight some of those conditions that are faced by many people providing labor in this country, and to also highlight the racialized aspect of this disparity in workers' rights, with many of these laborers coming from Mexico, South America, and Southeast Asia. Since 2006, May Day has also explicitly been known as a day for migrant struggles. In 2006, across the so-called United States, months of protests culminated in a Day Without Immigrants on May 1st to protest proposed immigration reforms to criminalize housing, food, and medical assistance to undocumented immigrants. The legacy of these protests is long-lasting and bears remembering as we fight in migrant justice struggles. I want to draw attention in particular to an event that happened this past month. In Montreal, Lucy Francinez Granados, a mother, friend, and outspoken activist for undocumented women and migrant workers, was detained and deported. Lucy came to Canada as an economic migrant and lived undocumented in Canada for 9 years in order to support her children in Guatemala. She had submitted an application for permanent residency on humanitarian grounds and was illegally blackmailed into disclosing her address in order for her application to be considered. In March, she was violently arrested in her home, and in mid-April, despite public outcry and the fact that the government was legally obliged to consider her application before, she was deported to Guatemala. She is one of many deported every month. Her deportation in particular is seen as a targeted attack on an active migrant justice advocate, showing how powerful her activism and community ties are, and the lengths to which the state will go to enforce an oppressive immigration system. May Day is also a day that invites us to look at wider systems that oppress us in multiple ways and to demand and fight for a world beyond these systems. Canada, a nation built on the genocide and land theft of Indigenous peoples, maintains borders meant to restrict people's free travel across this land and grants itself the authority to decide who is allowed in and who is allowed to stay, as well as who deserves protection and equal rights. Canada detains those it deems unworthy, a threat, or disposable, and deports many of them or forces them to stay in migrant detention. Through foreign mining projects, free trade agreements, and military interventions, it contributes to global conflict and instability and blocks those impacted from entering Canada. A refrain often used to sum up the goals of migrant justice movements that's really resonated with me is freedom to move, freedom to return, freedom to stay. It speaks to the fact that in a world where everyone doesn't have these freedoms, none of us are free. So let's look to ways to undermine the states that limit and police us. Let's not become extensions of borders and police in our own communities. Let's look for ways to support and care for each other. Let's be very mindful whenever we're talking about living on this land that Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants and stewards of this land, and that conversations around migrant justice must also be conversations about Indigenous sovereignty. Let's look to models of living on this land that predate borders, nation-states, prisons, and police. Let's take care of all the people in our communities and work towards a world without borders, where all are free to move, return, and stay. Thank you.
After the barbecue, the crowd marched down Princess Street, blocking the intersection in front of TD Bank to listen to an Indigenous woman speak about what's at stake in stopping pipeline construction and the inadequacy of environmental NGOs and politicians to solve the problems for us. The crowd paused again in front of Braybury Properties to listen to a member of the Limestone Solidarity Network denounce the company for their unwarranted and exorbitant move-out fees as part of an ongoing pressure campaign to force Braybury to withdraw the policy. The march concluded in Doug Fleur Park, another area targeted for a massive wave of so-called revitalization, where folks made placards denouncing gentrification and the destruction of waterfront land and zip-tied them to a fence surrounding a development site. A full report back on Kingston May Day can be found on the North Shore Counterinfo website at www.north-shore.info. On the West Coast, there were labor rallies in Victoria and Vancouver. Also in Vancouver, housing activists blocked the doors to City Hall and shut it down for the day, demanding that the municipal government there makes good on its social housing promises. Across the Prairie region, there were rallies and marches in Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, and Winnipeg. In Ontario, there were demonstrations in many cities, including Sudbury, Toronto, Hamilton, Kingston, Kitchener, and Ottawa. Significantly, tenants in East Hamilton chose May 1st to launch a rent strike in East Hamilton to resist an above-guideline rent increase of nearly 10% over 2 years. Tenants have pledged to withhold their rent until the increase is withdrawn and are collecting donations for their strike fund now. See the Hamilton Tenant Solidarity Network on Facebook to find out more. I caught up with Adam from Kitchener, who was able to tell us about May Day events this year in his city.
So my name's Adam. I suppose I'm an anarchist organizer in Kitchener-Waterloo on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. In Kitchener-Waterloo, basically, we just had a small kind of collective of us, kind of anarchist folks, get together and say, well, what do we want to do for May Day this year? Because Kitchener-Waterloo has had a few things happen for May Day, like maybe in the past 10 years or so, but they've been, relatively small and things like that. So our goal really was to try and kind of cast a wider net to try and pull people out into around some of the key themes related to May Day. So basically we just planned a sort of a day in the park kind of thing, started at 5 o'clock to give folks a chance, if they did have to go to work on May Day, to come after. And basically we just had a mix of speakers. We had some people who were doing various performances, music, kind of poetry stuff. We had people set up tables. We had some activities. There was a kids obstacle course and a rhythm and resistance kind of workshop. And then a bunch of food as well. So we basically just, put up a bunch of posters and basically tried to pull out kind of as many people as we could. And basically we ended up, one of our collective folks did a head count. We got about 120 people or so, we figure, which is, at least since I've lived in Kitchener-Waterloo, is I think the biggest May Day thing that's happened. So it feels like a relative success at this point. Obviously we want to figure out what can we do kind of going forward and things like that. But I guess in terms of our sort of framing, we had sort of framed it in kind of broad, in sort of a broad sense. So we really wanted to highlight some of the values around mutual aid, voluntary participation, personal and collective autonomy without authority, that kind of stuff. So I suppose we didn't lead with a hard edge, circle A kind of anarchism, but just trying to sort of spread some of those, I would say, sort of core kind of anarchist values and tie that into sort of the revolutionary spirit that comes out of May Day in the international workers kind of revolutionary sense, but also in terms of the coming of spring and some of the more kind of witchy kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, it certainly from afar it looked like an ambitious schedule that you folks came up with. Did that draw a lot of families out? Yeah,
I mean, my read was I didn't know a lot of the people who came, which I think in a small town where the kind of radical scene can be pretty small is kind of exciting either way. I think in general it was sort of it was maybe a little bit friends of friends kind of thing, but because we decided to set up right in Victoria Park, beside the clock tower, which is basically probably the most central location in Victoria Park, which is one of the larger parks in Kitchener. We got a lot of people just kind of passing by who kind of stopped in to sort of check out whatever was going on in the stage area. Definitely lots of people digging into the food, because we had sort of a potluck, and then also a sort of built your own burrito station, which everyone seemed to be super excited about. So then after things had kind of wound up, probably about 8 o'clock, towards 8:30, probably about, I would say about probably 40 or so people departed the park with some big, pretty epic May Day banners, and basically just went on a little, mobile march dance party situation through downtown Kitchener, which was pretty cool. It's sort of classic reclamation of space, but also keeping it sort of fun and festive with music and stuff rolling. There was a giant, pretty epic raccoon puppet that one of the collective members had made that everyone I think was really excited about. And then basically it just sort of turned into a dance party at Kitchener City Hall for a little while, and then we kind of ended off with some other music and stuff in this local kind of like arts sort of store space called Open Sesame. So I think that was like a nice like way to kind of wind down the night after being in the park and like kind of, talking through politics and some of those things a bit more explicitly, and, some classic like speakers and music performances and stuff, but then actually giving people a chance to really actively participate in like the reclamation of space and like doing a march and things like that. And I think everyone was like pretty excited about how that went. And other than like a couple of kind of alt-right kind of bro dudes who like showed up and were like videotaping people, which then very quickly basically found themselves, in the middle of a dance party feeling really awkward. Yeah, like we did get like quite a diverse crowd. By no means was it like, the typical, white anarchist or something like that. I think there was like a mix of people, and I think that's something we want to try in future years, because I think we're interested in doing it again, is how to sort of grow that further and kind of like spread that kind of revolutionary kind of energy.
Yeah, I admire the level of creativity that seemed to go into the planning of this event. And I noticed it's different than kind of the street march model that exists in a lot of other cities where, there's usually a rally and a march. That's kind of the template for May Day. So what were the ideas behind sort of taking a different tack, and how did they make sense in your context, in your local town?
Well, I think that's like the question of context, I think, is really what sort of informed some of our decisions around like the messaging and then the event itself. And I think part of, at least kind of how I saw it, was this is like an initial step. This is how we can start to maybe like build a broader, whatever you want to call it, culture of resistance, like openness to radical ideas, things like that. And so in my mind, it didn't make sense to do a kind of more classic, maybe more militant sort of march, because I don't think that's something that would have resonated with people, at least at this point. Like I think it would have with particular groups of people, but I don't think it would have drawn nearly as many people out. And so I think by having this broader maybe framing, but still having those sort of core, I would say, anarchist values in the middle of it, I think we were able to pull more people out, hopefully expose people to some of these kinds of like ideas and ways of thinking and types of organizing. And so I think going forward, I think we want to start to like build more, maybe not necessarily something that's more confrontational, but have those like anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian values like start to come through in the event even more. Because I think we sort of led less with that kind of a like hard, I would say like hard political, hard kind of anarchist edge, if you want to call it.
Are there things going on in KW right now that you were able to tie into the day, like that you're able to kind of give energy to and take forward coming out of May Day?
There was a few things. So like I think we were able to bring in a kind of like range of speakers in terms of people. Basically, we just asked people to sort of take 5 minutes and say, well, how does sort of May Day and the sort of spirit that we've sort of laid out so far, how does that sort of relate to like the organizing and the kind of stuff that you do? So we're fortunate to have some folks from the Indigenous Student Center at the University of Waterloo who have been doing a bunch of like organizing around sort of like kind of teaching stuff around colonization, decolonization, like sort of pushing some of those conversations forward. So they came and did like an opening and a closing and sort of talked about, histories of colonization in the context of kind of May Day. Somebody from Black Lives Matter Waterloo region who was able to like make it out and say a few words, that kind of thing. So I think we were able to pull in some of those people who were working on different struggles, and then try and sort of connect them. Well, we made a choice to sort of work a little bit with some of the other, kind of leftist revolutionary groups in town as well, which I think can always be a bit of maybe a gamble perhaps, because there was some people from like the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Revolutionary Students Movement and this other group called KW Against Fascism, which were going to do a more traditional sort of like march type of thing. And so we had actually reached out to them and said, here, this is kind of like what we're doing. I think there's space for like people with, some different politics to kind of to plug into this, and that, there's a way to build some common kind of ground, I guess, around some of like the anti-capitalist, anti-fascist kind of politics. So I think we were able to draw in some of that as well, which I think hopefully brought some other people out. the one thing that happened that was like kind of funny was I don't know how many people are familiar with the group Socialist Fight Back. Certainly, they've been sort of notable recently at York University for being, essentially banned or kicked off or whatever from the picket lines because of sort of like aggressive and sexually abusive behavior, and just kind of in general being really just unwilling to have some like pretty frank conversations about issues that people are having with them and the way they organize. And so they had asked, because we had sort of solicited people for proposals and ideas in the park because we wanted people to, get excited about plugging in. And they said, can we come with a table? And I sent them an email. I was like, you know what? No, like, we're not really interested in having Fight Back come and, distribute their materials, because the thing they often do is just kind of show up at people's things and, like, sell their newspaper, which we also weren't excited about at all, especially as, like, kind of like an anti-capitalist celebration. Like, we had said very specifically, we don't really want any kind of, like, money exchange going on. So of course they showed up at the park anyway, and then there was a little bit of a back and forth and whatever. They decided to leave, but there's this sort of like really comical, well, I would call it comical, like whatever communique post that they put out, which says like, Kitchener Mayday, Maoists and anarchists suppress democratic rights. And so they have this whole thing about how like they showed up and like we censored them and we like suppressed their democratic rights because we didn't want them to like set up a table at May Day. And it just kind of like, I don't know, it just sort of like goes through a whole bunch of things, but they also like name like a bunch of people in it, and like, they reprinted the like text of like the email back and forth that we had, which is like not that big a deal, but I feel like in some ways this post actually really illustrates why we didn't want them to be part of the event, because I think they are like a group that is totally willing to like sabotage other people's like events and projects for their own gain. And I actually think this like the tone and tenor of this whole thing that they put out about, democratic rights and censorship, I'm kind of like, we're like hanging out in a park for May Day, and we're talking about politics, and kids are doing obstacle courses, and people are making art, and there's food. Like, I'm kind of like, come on. So that was the scandal.
The scandal of the year. I was unaware of it. It hasn't gone viral yet.
But yeah, they've been sort of like spreading this around, so it's something that like I need to respond to. And
speaking of that, did you find that there, given that there's an Ontario election coming up, did anybody try to bring a partisan kind of perspective to May Day, or were you able to sort of chart a different way forward for people than the election?
Well, I was surprised because we had, in our initial meetings, we had sort of said, okay, what are our sort of like key commitments, which I think are like kind of pretty standard things for most of us, like no cops. We're not really that interested in necessarily like an ongoing media dialogue, and no politicians, because I think a lot of the kind of some of the progressive politics anyway that happen in Kitchener-Waterloo are very embedded in and connected to the party politics that are going on. And part of this comes through this discourse is Kitchener-Waterloo has a lot of like women who are elected representatives at the like federal, provincial, and like municipal levels, which obviously there's something to that type of representation in an typically very male-dominated space. But I feel like that it doesn't really, in my mind, doesn't really go beyond that discussion sometimes. And so we get into these, it's like, oh yeah, our region is so progressive because we have all these like women who are politicians. I'm kind of like, I don't, like, does that really matter when they're a member of the Conservative Party or even the Liberal Party? Like, it seems like a really limited viewpoint to sort of like say that we're progressive, or that like politics are moving forward, or that this is even like a good thing, and that's like actually in the interest of lots of like kind of regular people. So I had sort of thought that maybe a bunch of people would show up, people from the Liberal Party or other politicians and things like that, and they didn't, at least as far as I could see, which I thought was interesting. Especially, as you mentioned, there's the election coming up, and everyone's sort of swinging into like partisan propaganda politics here, but that didn't happen at May Day. And I haven't thought too much about necessarily why that is. Maybe they just didn't. Maybe they thought that it was too much of a niche, radical thing. Maybe it wasn't on their radar. I'm not sure. Maybe they knew that they weren't going to be welcome. I don't know.
Yeah, in Kingston, we found like whenever it's an election year, the NDP and the Green Party, and one year even the Conservative Party came to May Day and attempted to sort of campaign a little bit. And yeah, I think people here have just, not told them to leave, but just not given them the microphone either. Just kind of kept the focus on the anti-capitalist thrust of International Workers' Day has been our strategy here. So what happens with the May Day Coalition between now and next year? Do you kind of disperse into your other projects and check back in January or something, or is there going to be an ongoing project here?
I'm not sure. We haven't really sort of figured that out at this point. The idea is that we're going to have a follow-up kind of debrief meeting this week to sort of look at some of these things and sort of figure out kind of where we're going. Because in Kitchener-Waterloo, the other thing, like there is a big sort of, Labor Day picnic thing that happens, instigated by, I think, the local Labor Council, like on Labor Day. And I've heard rumblings of people talking, for a few years about how can, there maybe be some more radical politics starting to come into some of those spaces, and also just to maybe find some of those like other rank and file people who are maybe part of labor unions or like who very much self-identify as workers maybe, and how can some of those people start to also, get involved in maybe more radical projects, and how can we sort of build connections to some of those different like movements and spaces. So I think that's something that we're kind of interested in going forward, and we'll kind of see. I think the other thing is that I'm not sure where things are going to go at this point, but just in terms of our relationship as anarchists with some of these other, sort of communist groups in town, like the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Revolutionary Students Movement, who have been involved in some of these kind of anti-fascist actions and things like that. And so I think we're starting to figure out, well, are there things that maybe it does make sense for us to work together on, but there's probably also some things that don't. Because we did put out a collective statement for May Day, which I think in the end everyone was sort of like generally kind of happy with, but there was a bit of friction between the kind of anarchist and communist politics over that, especially around some of the things around the sort of like, witchy, pagan, like Beltane, coming of spring revolutionary energy aspects of May Day, which I think there's a bunch of folks on our organizing collective who are like, that's part of how they ground themselves in the world, is like through some of those types of politics. And a bunch of the communist folks were just like hard stop, like, no. Like, we don't want to talk about magic. We don't want to talk about spirituality. We don't want to talk about like connections to land and nature and play and joy and some of that kind of stuff. And so like there's some pretty obvious like friction of politics there, which I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised by. But I feel like it's put a few more things maybe more out in the open than they were before, and I think that's part of what going forward is going to look like, is how is the organizing going to go forward? Is it going to continue to sort of be this smaller collective of people who sort of take it on, and then other people kind of plug into things? I think there's like some energy now, and so I think we want to figure out, well, how can we kind of keep some of this energy going, so it's not just there's a big KW May Day thing like on May 1st, but how does some of these politics and some of this energy sort of carry on like throughout the rest of the year?
And if anybody listening wants to connect with some of the anarchist and anti-capitalist organizing in Kitchener-Waterloo, are there places you could point them to?
Yeah, so a bunch of us who were on the May Day Collective are basically have another sort of more explicitly anarchist collective that's called the Black Umbrella. So, we have a Facebook page, but we also have a Rise Up email address, which is just theblackumbrella@riseup.net. We don't have anything sort of like immediately coming up because we've had a lot of our energies going into the May Day stuff, but I think we're interested in starting to sort of build some more kind of like explicit anarchist projects in politics in Kitchener-Waterloo and have that be like something that's like really visible. That's probably the best way to get in touch with us. I think for us, it's like, we feel like this year's May Day went really well, and it's like this is going to be a stepping stone to future things. And I think one of the things we've learned is like it's really important to try and organize some of these things like in ways that resonate in our own context. I think that's probably, you know, something useful for people to think about, you know, wherever they are. If they want to start organizing projects or they want to do something for May Day, what does it sort of look like where you are, and how can you start kind of there and start to build things?
It don't make no sense. Humane with evilest intent. The truth is like a gas spreading through the vents, making the banks repent till our hearts content. Still, they got the nerve to ask, like, how come we keep them fists clenched? The reasons for that be endless, written in the prison bars and picket white fences. State-paid henchmen, heavy pig stench, and load of profit. Round our ways, them dollars, they ain't never stopping. The game builds upon the losers and monopolies the object. The world's now toxic, but you already knew that. The main question is still, where the hell the food at? And the genetically modified ingredients combined with dollar signs to try to relieve the itch.
Dollars rule earth, the dollar sign. Right, right, right. The dollar bill fill the field with the grave till the yield crop, causing loss. Poverty's costs are shocking, while the profit pop from the boss's pocket. Say dollar gained at the expense and pain of most folks is left broke, hopeless. Voting's a rope-a-dope, but a lot more rope than dope, though, you know. Oh, dollar earned, burn the earth, made the dirt out of your wages. Hey, slave labor's great for stock trade. Boss favors on the top payment. Say dollar kills, fill the earth full of holes. Sold to to finance it, to frack and refine the finest shine they gon' find on the surface or inside of her. Dollars rule earth, the dollar sign. Right, right, right. Dollar slaughter, sons, daughters, tables of water. Blood's gon' spill, ecocide kills. Charts the ill versus the profit yield, you feel? Dollar plotting, count the coffin, count the grave, count the dollars made. Oligarchs hate to pay the wages. They've made an art out of the legal slavery. Say dollar lies, hide the truth behind the guise of our common interest. We the victims, they inflicted it. Distant, dismissed our coexistences. Dollar burns, Mama Earth's on fire for guys in suits and ties. They despise all types of life. They designed this doomsday device. Dollars rule earth, the dollar sign. Right, right, right.
Yo, for the record, no one consented to these searches. The laws and declarations of this nation's emergence. Nah, nor its damn purpose. Pleasure man built over murdered clan hills, and they wonder why we nervous. Exterminated for the sake of dollars worship. Again, monopoly refurbishes organic perfection with that worthless merchant urges. For your meds, they got home delivery. For the homeless, they reserve that starving and the shivering. Tune in tonight at 10 o'clock to see the heavy price that some pay to be living free. And when the trust runs out, and all that's left is money's taste in your mouth, most of y'all will say we weren't trying to get paid, we're just trying to make it to the next day, okay?
You're listening to From Embers, a regular podcast about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice throughout so-called Canada. Check us out at fromembers.libsyn.com.
And this is our roundup of May Day events 2018. In Quebec, there were May Day events in Quebec City and Montreal. Montreal is well known for a large amount of anarchist activity, and for the past several years there have been high-profile combative demonstrations on May Day. This year, there were 3 separate May Day demonstrations in Montreal. I spoke with someone from the CLAC, which in French stands for the Convergence of Anti-Capitalist Struggles, who was able to tell me about the CLAC and explain what happened Tuesday evening in Montreal.
The CLAC is the Anti-Capitalist Convergence of Montreal. It was founded initially in 2000 for the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City in 2001. The objective was to make an anti-capitalist convergence for the summit. So the CLAC did this and then disbanded. When the G20 occurred in Toronto in 2010, the CLAC was reformed and decided to make a wide mobilization so people could go to Toronto. After the Toronto event, however, the CLAC decided to stay together and to keep organizing the anti-capitalist May Day. There was a few years where it was organized by other groups, but since 2012, I would say 2011, 2012, it's been organized in part by the CLAC.
I noticed this year there were multiple demos in Montreal. So is that new for Montreal, that there's multiple demos?
No, it isn't. It started, I guess, after 2012 because repression was very thorough, to say it bluntly, in Montreal. So when we tried to do some protest in 2013, for instance, everybody got arrested. So an alternative strategy was developed to have multiple starting points, multiple protests going on. That said, this year the CLAC only organized one protest, the one at 6 p.m. in the Parc La Fontaine. There was another protest organized by the Communists, the Revolutionary Communist Party, and another protest organized by the IWW in the Parc Extension, which is a traditionally very, very immigrant neighborhood. And the IWW, after the protest, joined the CLAC protest.
And so what was the tone of the call-out? Like, what were some of the themes that were touched on for this year's May Day in Montreal?
We were pretty close to the IWW this year, and the main theme was racism, because we see a very, very strong far-right movement growing in Quebec, and we see that the media are capitalizing, to take the real word, on this rise to make money, and we see that politicians are capitalizing on this rise to get votes. Basically, it's the same thing as usual. It's a divide and conquer. So the rich people want to maintain their benefits. They see that the current situation is unstable, and the only solution they see is letting people fight between each other. So the rise of racism and the rise of the far right for them is a good thing. And we see that in the media every day with fake news or, borderline fake news being distributed as fact across main media sources. And we see that as a serious threat to us, to everyone, and to our communities, and especially to immigrant population, which have been targeted very strongly in the last few years. I don't know if you've seen it, for instance, on May Day, when the IWW did the protest in Parc Extension, a Nazi fucker went to the roof of a building and waved a Nazi flag. And this is in one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in Canada. So with a large population of Jewish people, which were very, very angry about the display of power by the far right.
Were there other interactions or confrontations with white supremacists or with the far right this year on May Day?
Not on May Day itself, but there have been a few, yes. If you've seen the news, yesterday there's a large document which was distributed to the media showing one of the main instigator of Nazi propaganda in North America actually resides in Montreal, and they found out who he was and where he lives. But that's not nothing to do with the CLAC nor May Day, actually.
So what happened at the demonstration, the CLAC May Day demonstration this year?
Well, we didn't break any records, that's for sure. I think the protest lasts between 4 and 7 minutes. Just after the start, there was some confrontation because in Montreal, the police always try to take over the sidewalks. but the protests want to take the whole street, the street and the sidewalks. And there was a confrontation near the head of the protest. People started throwing fireworks, and the cops responded with a lot of tear gas, for which a lot of people were not properly prepared. But nonetheless, repression was quite violent. We were, I think, 500, 600 people at the start of the protest, but there were probably the same number of cops. And they were very, very violent in trying to disperse any group that tried to stay together. So we were dispersed in about the first 5 minutes, but a few groups tried to reform and walk again. They were very violently repressed. We had at least one person sent to the hospital. I saw a few other people were probably going to the clinic the next day, mostly broken fingers and stuff like that. About an hour later, we managed to regroup at the subway station and actually do an anti-capitalist protest for about an hour and disperse in the subway station. As far as we know, we got about 5 or 6 arrests. I think 5 arrests on criminal charges, 1 arrest with a bogus ticket. Most of the charge, as far as we've seen, are bogus also from what we've seen, and we'll see if the police try to go forward with them, but we expect most of the charge to be dropped.
Were any of the arrests under the pretext of the anti-demonstration laws passed during the last wave of student strikes?
The good news is most of these laws were beaten down, at least in Montreal. So there's no longer required to give your itinerary to protest, and there's no longer a need to remove your mask, so you can protest with your mask on. So I don't think so. The new modus operandi of the police, so to speak, is they wait for something borderline criminal to happen, something they flag as criminal, and after that they say, okay, it's free for all, just hit everyone until everyone's gone. And they switch the mass arrest tactics of the 2012 to 2015 to a tactic of just hitting everyone until everyone's gone.
Like, how do you manage to regroup after being so violently dispersed? Do you use social media to regroup?
We used social media in the previous years, but it didn't work out because each time we tried to regroup, we found out that the cops were there before us. So this year we tried to do it with word of mouth, but it's not as effective. We started about with 500, 600, and when we tried to regroup, we're at most 100, I think, maybe 50, 100. So we're still trying stuff to see how we can protest and regroups and be more resilient in face of repression.
Is there any support needed for any of the people who were injured or arrested?
As of right now, no. Of course, financial support will be needed for the defense of the people arrested. We do have a legal fund, but with the G7 looming over the horizon, of course, money will be needed.
Yeah, so if we could talk about that, I did see the call out for the May Day demo. One call out at least framed May Day as a way to kind of prepare and set the tone for some of the resistance to the G7 summit, which is happening this June 8th and 9th outside of Quebec City. Would you be able to tell our listeners about that and kind of what's in store for that?
The CLAC kick-started a group for organizing the protest against the G7, but the group now is out of the end of the CLAC. The CLAC is still involved, but it's a much wider coalition. The group is called the Réseau de Résistance Anti-G7, RRAG7. The website is antig7.org. And the plan right now is we have a protest on Thursday night, June 7th at 6 p.m. starting in Quebec City at the Parc des Braves. There's another day of disruption planned for June 8th, Friday, June 8th. The objective to disrupt the activities of the G7. The RAG 7 is planning an action on the beginning of June 8th, but the details are still to come. We just know that the action should take place at around 7:30 in the morning. And on June 9th, Saturday, June 9th, more activities will be planned, but they are not confirmed just yet. The RAG 7 is planning its activities in Quebec City, where most of the actual negotiation will take place. But the leaders will actually meet in a town about an hour from Quebec called La Malbaie. Everybody was thinking initially to go to La Malbaie, but it turns out they really turned the place into a fortress. So I'm guessing some people will try to go anyway, but the main protests, at least the one that RAG 7 is organizing, will take place in Quebec City.
And what's the CLAC website?
The CLAC website is www.clac-montreal.net. And you'll find everything you need about what is the CLAC, how the CLAC works. And RAG 7, like I said, is anti-G7.org.
Moving east from Montreal, I caught up with Art from the Industrial Workers of the World, one of the groups involved with May Day in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where overzealous cops made 2 arrests for marching on the street without a permit.
So I'm Art. I'm in the IWW, local IWW branch, Halifax Chibuktuk. We've been organizing in this city now for about 2 years. We have several ongoing campaigns, and we run a bunch of sort of subcommittees and solidarity committees, and basically try to encourage workers to take direct action in their workplace.
The IWW is an organization with a long history of class struggle in specifically in North America, right?
Yeah, North America, but also in Britain and Australia, and pretty significantly in Mexico, I think, with the Maganista movement around before the revolution.
And when you say you encourage workers to take direct action in their workplaces, what do you mean by that, and sort of how do you distinguish yourselves from what most people think unions do generally?
Right, so I think the IWW organizes and always has organized on the idea that there are no sort of union leaders, no union leadership. Rather, the members are the union in the most direct sense possible. Meaning, so in terms of representation, it means that all delegates within the IWW have no sort of administrative power. Everything is sort of decided by referendum at the local branch level, which is a big difference from trade unions, where the executive essentially is the union decision-making body, and the members are not really. But to get to your question about direct action in the workplace, we basically believe that workers can change their conditions most effectively when they do it by choosing, organizing collectively a list of demands or goals that they're after, and achieving those through direct work actions. The big difference in Canada between this and trade unions is that trade unions only can do work action during contract negotiations, meaning that every 2 or 3 years, after a certain number of administrative and bureaucratic hoops are jumped through, a union can decide whether or not to go on strike or to do, a work to rule or something like that. The IWW in Canada, because it does not have any leadership, can't be recognized as a union according to the labor law in this country, and therefore workers do not have to wait for every 2 years or at any specific time to take work action. They're encouraged at all times to take work action, basically to improve their situations. And we believe that basically that model is the way in which throughout labor history, workers have actually made gains in the workplace, and that in general, the way in which trade unions operate and the reason labor law exists as it does is basically to curtail and control workers' power in the workplace, right? That power to do direct action at any time.
What kind of campaigns do your group have going in Halifax right now, and how did you tie that into May Day this year?
So we have like several member campaigns that I can't really get into because they're pretty under wraps. They're not public yet. But we also are in solidarity, like working in solidarity with two SEIU campaigns that have been going on in the city and that have been gaining quite a lot of like media attention, particularly the Justice for Janitors campaign, which was a campaign about, I think it was like 7 African and African descent workers were fired unjustly from their like long-term unionized workplace as an act of union busting, and then we decided, because of this sort of like intersection of devaluing both unskilled labor and also racialized laborers, we thought it was like a good point to sort of work with. And then also the other campaign is the Baristas Rise Up campaign, which is a group of baristas in like the biggest local chain of coffee shops have filed or have done a bunch of work actions against their boss, like pickets, mostly information pickets, and we've been participating in those. Specifically, the latter campaign, I think, has really garnered a lot of positive support because of how egregious sort of the business practices of the the coffee shop owner, Kit Singh, like his practices are just like so obviously egregious and in the wrong that people are really supporting sort of the coffee shop workers. And in that campaign, I think because of that support, there was a lot more people showing up at May Day than would have in the past potentially.
So what happens on May Day in Halifax? What happened this year?
This year there was like, as usual, there's sort of like the trade unions and the NDP kind of put on a rally. We had some speeches, and then we went on to do a march, and that happened, I think, last year for the first time that there was a march up in the north end of the city. That march last year took, I think, the local city police by surprise, and they weren't really pleased that we had not asked permission to do the march or whatever. And then this year, because of that reaction last year, the cops and the city police were really sort of like on us, basically. Marching in the street in the city, I don't know why, is like kind of looked down upon. When we got up into the north end of the city onto Gottingen Street, the police assaulted several marchers who had refused to march on the sidewalk. At the end, when the rally, right before actually the rally reached its end point, the cops stopped the march and then arrested 2 people who were unaffiliated with the IWW, basically for, I think, wearing masks or disrupting the peace or something like that, but I'm not sure.
Were they charged?
They were not charged, but they were detained for the day, and there was supporters outside there waiting for them.
Is it unusual in Halifax for a march to take the street, or does this happen all the time?
No, it's pretty unusual. I mean, not the times that it does take the street, it tends to be permitted and very straightforward in that way. So I think the reason why this happened this year, this arrest happened, was just because it was an unpermitted march, right?
And I'm assuming the choice to not get a permit was deliberate, like that there's a reason people don't want to get permits.
Yeah, I think the reason why you don't permit your march is because, one, it doesn't actually protect you more. If the cops still want to assault and arrest people, they will. Secondarily, it's sort of counterintuitive, right? I mean, May Day is about the class struggle between the state and workers, right? I mean, to kind of ask to ask the same people who you're protesting against or who you're rallying against to permit you to have your rally is a bit counterintuitive and kind of pointless in my mind.
I would have to agree with you. The statement that you put out afterwards pointed to some of these campaigns you mentioned, Justice for Janitors and Baristas Rise Up, and specifically mentioned this hope for reinvigoration of the labor movement in Halifax. Do you find that May Day contributed to that? And what do you see sort of carrying forward from the event this year?
Yeah, so I think the participation of the IWW in these campaigns hasn't really been like pivotal. Rather, I think like there's a lot of self-organization going on, particularly in the Baristas Rise Up campaign, that I think is quite promising. And then also because of the public support, it is really sort of getting people to talk more openly about sort of labor and labor standards and how, workers win things even, so the kind of like abstract debates that are good for us, for our purposes, in that we can sort of bring a line that is a bit different, So I think, I think these campaigns are making these conversations in industries that the union movement used to say were impossible to organize or didn't need to be organized because they weren't real jobs or something. It's making those conversations happen there in a good way. And
where can people find out more about these campaigns in your group?
Well, our group has a Facebook page which we regularly update, IWW Chibuktuk, in parentheses Halifax GMB. If you don't have Facebook, you can also go to IWW.org, which will have contact information for us, for our local, and then also the SEIU Local 2 has a website that people can visit too.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show. Best of luck in your campaigns, and we'll stay in touch. This concludes our roundup of May Day events across so-called Canada. Music tonight was by Chumbawamba, Ratatat, and Lee Reed. You've been listening to From Embers, a weekly show of anarchist ideas and practice on CFRC 101.9 FM here in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks for listening.